Good morning, everybody. It's nice to have you back again for another video. This video is going to be again about the rise of totalitarianism, but this time we're talking about the rise of totalitarianism when it comes to Stalin's dictatorship over the Soviet Union, or the USSR. Now, here we see a map of the Soviet Union, and also what you can see there in the back, embedded into it is an overlay of the flag of the Soviet Union. The important part there that I want you guys to look at is the symbol, which is the hammer and the sickle, representing the unification of two important members of Soviet society in comradeship and equality. The hammer, of course, represents the industrial factory workers. The sickle, of course, represents the peasant farmers who were supposed to be made whole and included in all of society, and the bourgeoisie were going to be removed from power, and ultimately the Soviets were going to take control of the whole country and everything was going to be great forever. Of course, that was the idea, but when it started, of course, Lenin began with a policy called war communism. And in war communism, what that means is that the government was going to take ownership of all of the means of production. Every farm, every house, every mine, every factory, absolutely everything belonged to the state. And then they would do things like, if you were a rich person who had a mansion, they would come to your house and say, by the way, you've got 20 rooms in this house. Here's 19 other families that are going to move in with you because we actually own this house now. It's not your property, it's state property. And ultimately what happens then is when they start doing that sort of thing with a business, people really aren't terribly happy about this, and Soviet production slows down, especially when it comes to farms. And the estimate is in 1921 there was a famine, which means they didn't grow enough food, and of course what happened was about 5 million people literally just starved to death. Beyond that, and in addition to that, Lenin had a person who was one of his lieutenants, one of the people who really assisted him in the continuation of the Russian Revolution, and that guy's name was Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin wasn't Russian, he was Georgian, first of all, but one of the things that's true about him is he was absolutely brutal in the way that he approached accomplishing his tasks, and Lenin always knew that if you had to have something absolutely done, you sent Stalin, because no matter what would happen, Stalin would get it done. And so one of the problems they realized was that there was a lot of starvation. There wasn't enough food going around. So Stalin was put in charge of solving that problem, and one of the things he came up with was it wasn't actually war communism that was making the economy fail and making the famines happen. It must have been secret capitalists, secret bourgeoisie who were hoarding all the food, and that's why there wasn't enough to go around. So he said, well, let's solve that problem. Where do we grow most of our food? Well, we grow most of our food in the Ukraine. So if those are the people growing the food, those are the people hoarding the food, and if those are the people hoarding the food, we need to make an example of them and show everybody else that it's not a good idea to hoard food. So Stalin then engineered a process called Holodomor, which is an engineered famine where even though they were growing lots of food in Ukraine, they weren't receiving any back to actually feed their people. And as a result of this, one of the things we see is a huge starvation campaign among the Ukrainians. It's somewhere around 8 million Ukrainians were starved to death on purpose by Stalin, just specifically to try to reinforce this idea of Lenin's communism, war communism. Now, after the civil war in Russia came to an end, one of the things we see is that Lenin comes to the realization that war communism isn't going to work. Jumping immediately to communism in Russia is not going to work. So he actually backs off of that a little bit and starts a new program called the NEP, the New Economic Program. And really the way that he fixed war communism was he let people, individual people or families, own small businesses in their local area. So maybe a bakery or a flower shop or whatever it was. And if you did a really good job running your business and you worked really hard and you made a really good product that people really liked, you could make a profit. And under the new economic program, you could actually keep that profit too. And the consequence of that, of course, was that people really went over and above to try to work hard in these businesses to make them successful and to make their products really, really good. Whereas if you work in a Soviet state factory, there's no incentive to do a good job. There's no incentive to do a job at all. Because really, you can't be fired, you can't be demoted, you can't have your pay cut because, of course, communism is all about absolutely forced equality. When Lenin shifted to the new economic program, it at least let the Soviet Union bounce back enough to survive into the middle of the 1920s. Now, that's also when we get to the next big problem, which is in 1924, Lenin died unexpectedly. And he left really two guys behind that were really important in terms of who was going to be the next leader. The man on the left, his name is Leon Trotsky. He was a communist intellectual. He was a right-hand man of Lenin. And of course, the guy on the right is still Joseph Stalin. Now, these two guys really disagreed with each other over how to move forward in the communist revolution. Trotsky, on the left, was what we call an internationalist. And what that means is he believed that you couldn't really get to the stage of communism unless you first freed all the workers of the whole world. And so his focus was really on spreading the revolution that started in Russia to the rest of the world so that ultimately it could become real, true, genuine Karl Marx style communism once the proletariat of the whole world had been liberated from the bourgeoisie. Now, that's actually going to be a problem for Trotsky too, because he's going to be traveling all around the world trying to spread revolutions, and when Lenin dies, he's not really going to be there a whole lot, so that gives Stalin kind of an open door to be able to do whatever he wants to gain power, and that's exactly what he's going to do. Now, Stalin, on the other hand, really looked at the Soviet Union and said, what we want to do, instead of spreading the revolution first, is we want to make a perfect communist utopia in the Soviet Union, and this is what he called communism in one country. Once that's successful, he said, we'll be so powerful that we'll simply conquer the rest of the world and force them to be communists, and that's ultimately how we will get to the end game of making the whole world a communist country. Now, Stalin, of course, is brutal and manipulative. He controls all information in the Soviet Union. Every book that is published, every radio broadcast that goes out, everything is absolutely, totally, 100% censored. And that control of information really gives him a humongous amount of power. He uses things like Russification. He uses programs like forced collectivization. So he would go to a group of farmers and say, this isn't your land anymore. You don't own it anymore. The government owns it. You're all now going to work together to produce crops for the government to then redistribute to everybody else. Now, when it comes to Stalin, of course, one of the things he was willing to do was to murder his enemies, and he absolutely did this. Stalin quite often would go through a series of events called purges, where he would find people who he thought were disloyal to him. And of course, he had a huge spy network, the KGB, specifically dedicated to spying on people inside the Soviet Union, and the NKVD as well, to have informers everywhere to let him know when people were not totally and completely loyal to him. He also had a lot of people who supported Trotsky murdered, or kicked out of the party, or kicked out of the country, and it was really just, he was a brutal guy who did anything necessary to get his way. And the really scary thing about Stalin is when he purged people, he didn't just kill them, he also erased them. So on the left, you can see two different photographs. The first one, of course, is Stalin with a man named Nikolai Yashov. On the bottom photograph, you can see this was after Yashov had disagreed with Stalin, and Stalin not only had him killed, but he also had the people who worked for him go back into the state archives, find the pictures, the photographs of any time Nikolai Yashov was in a state photograph, and they erased him from existence. So that it's not just that he lived and he died, now it's he never existed. So we don't even get to remember him and what he disagreed with Stalin about. He is being erased completely. The photo on the right, of course, at the top, you can see a photo of Lenin with Trotsky and with a few other people, but of course the photo on the bottom, when Stalin has those photographs reissued to put in textbooks and things like that, Trotsky's gone. This actually is one of the most famous examples. That's Lenin, announcing the creation of the Soviet Union in 1921, and to the right of him, you can see Trotsky standing in his Red Army uniform. When Stalin has this photograph reissued for Soviet textbooks and things like that, you can see the stage has been extended so that Trotsky is ultimately no longer a factor. You're not allowed to remember Trotsky. He was a bad guy. He's not Stalin. And so what happens here is Stalin sets up an absolutely totalitarian dictatorship. He controls every element of Soviet society. He is brutal and forceful and will do whatever he needs to, including violence, to get his way, while at the same time he wants to be seen as the father of the nation. Now, when things don't go well for him, of course, he has to come up with answers to why these things aren't going well. One of the people, or groups of people rather, that Stalin blames are a group of people called kulaks, which is Kulaks, kulaks. Kulaks were defined as people who had a few more cows and between 5 and 6 more acres than the people living around them. So they're not very wealthy people. They're not, huge landowners. They don't own plantations. They're just a little more wealthy than anybody else around them. Stalin said that those kulaks must have been what he called latent capitalists. These are people who will not conform to the communist standard of equality. And so what he does is he has them purged. And to do that, he does a couple of things. Number one is he uses a system which is called the Gulag system. Every red dot on this map of the Soviet Union represents a gulag. A gulag is a system of forced labor. They are labor camps, slave labor camps, where a person is going to be sent to be worked to death for the good of the Soviet Union. Stalin has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different gulags set up. And kulaks, a lot of them were ordered to report there. The estimates are about 6 million kulaks were outright executed by Stalin's government. In addition to that, then 24 million of them were forced off of their family farms. But when we look back through the Soviet state archives, only about 12.5 million of the people who were forced off of their farms actually registered for state employment someplace else in the Soviet Union. So what that means is about 6 million kulaks are just outright murdered. About 12 million kulaks are sent to gulags and just disappeared from the face of the Soviet Union. This is the kind of control that Stalin's got, and this is the kind of dictatorship that Stalin's going to run. It is brutal, it is horrible, and it is nasty. This is a gulag, and you can see all of these people have been condemned to slave labor for one reason or another. And it could be something as simple as the guy next door let the authorities know that I said something bad about Stalin. Right? During the Great Purges, one of the things we see is that humongous numbers of people are being exterminated, they're being forcibly starved to death, they're being sent to internment camps, worked to death. These particular victims are ethnic minorities that were exterminated as a part of the Russification programs of the Great Purges in 1933 and 1934. Another example, and again, I like to use a lot of these very specific examples of how Stalin works, is if you look at a map of Central Asia, a lot of times you'll see a body of water there which is called the Aral Sea, A-R-A-L. Now, when you see a map with the Aral Sea on it, generally it's going to look like what it did in 1957 on the top left-hand side of this particular slide. Now, Stalin realized that there was a really big problem when it comes to the production of cotton in this region of the world. And the problem is that this region is in a desert. But then he also realized that the Aral Sea had a humongous amount of water flowing into it from 2 different rivers. And so Stalin decided that what they were going to do was they were going to dam up both of those rivers and redivert the water to producing irrigation for cotton plantations. He decided that was what was going to happen, and so of course it happened. When that happened, though, people started to notice about 20 years later that the coastline was getting further and further and further away, to the point where eventually the 2 lobes of the Aral Sea divided in the early part of the 2000s. Today, the eastern lobe of the Aral Sea is completely and totally gone. The Aral Sea is one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters that has ever occurred, and it happened as a result of Joseph Stalin basically saying, do this now because I said so, and everybody else was so afraid of him that they wouldn't say no. This particular photograph is really kind of sad because, of course, what we see is the old fishing fleet from the Aral Sea, and now you can see that obviously it's rusted out. They're no longer used anymore. It's sitting in the middle of the desert when this is a region that used to produce enormous amounts of food to feed people in the Soviet Union. Today, of course, it's a total and complete disaster. Now, the second big piece of this thing that we have to understand about Soviet Union under Stalin is when he's doing these horrible, awful, brutal things, he's not telling everybody that he's doing it, and there's really no way for that information to get out of the Soviet Union. So a lot of people in the 1920s and the 1930s believed a lot of the propaganda that was coming out of the Soviet Union that Stalin controlled. So a lot of people had an idea of communism that it was great and everything was working really well because they weren't seeing the negative things that Stalin refused to show them. In place of the truth, what Stalin did is he created a new style of art, which is called socialist realism, and we're going to look at some examples of that. So here's one where Lenin, in the hat, of course, is out talking to peasants, and of course it's a bright sunny day, and he's addressing the concerns of the peasants and bringing the peasants into this condition of equality with everybody else. It's bright, it's happy, it's sunny, we're taking care of people's problems. This is what Stalin wants people to think of, not only Lenin, but also of the Soviet Union. The next example here, of course, is a picnic where everybody's together and everybody's equal and there's no more class divisions and we're having a picnic and a party and a celebration and everybody's happy and everyone's doing great. Right? This painting, of course, is of Lenin, and the kind of light of wisdom and knowledge and leadership shines down on him, and just everything's wonderful, right? Some peasant women and men sitting out in the fields just enjoying an afternoon because everything's going just really well in the Soviet Union. This is what drew a lot of people, even a lot of Americans, into the Communist Party, especially in the 20s and the 30s, because nobody knew any different. People thought this is what the Soviet Union must be like because this is what all the information coming out of the Soviet Union shows them. Now this one's actually a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. One of the things you'll notice is this is children, and they're all wearing a red bandana around their neck. They are part of what is called the Young Pioneers movement. The Young Pioneers was basically like the communist Boy and Girl Scouts. And they would go and learn the greatness of, working in factories and industrialization and the proletariat and sticking up for the people who don't know how to stick up for themselves and that sort of thing. And it was required that if you wanted to get a good job, you had to be a member of the Young Pioneers movement. So this was something to ultimately brainwash children. And if you'll notice, when it comes to these totalitarian dictators, controlling education was a really big thing, because ultimately when you get children as they're young, they never ever learn how to question, and that makes your control complete and total. So the Young Pioneers was a really big part of that. Now this particular painting I really hated, actually, because it makes me sick. These little kids, of course, are looking up to Papa Joe, up to Joseph Stalin in this kind of loving fashion. He's got this great look of leadership on him, and what is awful is when you compare this to the pictures of the kids in camps being starved to death, being sent to gulags, being just outright murdered because they're the wrong ethnicity. When you try to reconcile those two things together, it really shows you the mind of Joseph Stalin and what he wants people to think versus what the truth is. Now, a couple of good things we do have to say about the Soviet Union, though. One of the good things about the Soviet Union is when it comes to the idea of equality, men and women in the Soviet Union really did have a much larger degree of equality than what we see in basically any other country in the world at the time. The Soviet Union was very progressive when it came to things like gender equality and that sort of stuff, and so here we can see that being played up in the socialist realism. The final one we've got, of course, is a statue of the workers and the farmers coming together under the hammer and sickle to the kind of modern wave future of state control and the people who run the party, Joseph Stalin guiding us to something better and something wonderful. So that's Stalin's Soviet Union and him, in power, and some of the consequences of him being in power and having this totalitarian dictatorship. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the rise of National Socialism and Adolf Hitler in Germany in the interwar period, and that one's going to be the very last section before we transition into World War II. So as always, I hope these videos are finding you well. I hope everybody is healthy. I hope everybody is safe, and I hope that I'm going to see you back here in the next video.